She then segued seamlessly to a song of pain and loss about the passing of her mother just before the contagion arrived on our shores. The lights bathed her in azure, the creases in her face turning to small streams, filled by the tears gently falling down her cheeks. Judging by the prairie of gray hair in the audience, everyone in the room had lost at least one parent, and most probably had said farewell to both. Orphans, in the way that a 70-year-old, feeling her mother's last breath against her face in hospice, understands that with mom and dad both now gone, part of her has disappeared too. Many eyes glistened along with the performers as she sang of her mother, painting a portrait of a woman seen through a child's loving eyes, but remembered from the vantage point of a distant land. The dusky stage lights caught lines in her face, the sea foam of her hair, the floral print on her blouse, transforming her into a blue-tinged mosaic. It was a Picasso come to life in a blue period along with the rest of the world.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Edmonds. I am the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Mark Rosati. He is the author of Fermata, which we had the privilege of publishing in our second issue. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. And again, Sarah, thanks so much for publishing the story. It meant a great deal.
Absolutely. We all love the story. In that time when we were publishing it, pandemic stories were a really, really hard sell for us because it's all so raw. We're all still living through it, but it was too wonderful of a story to pass up on. Yeah, and if you don't mind, tell us a little bit more of the story. Set it up for us, please.
Sure. Well, it was basically grew out of a date that my wife and I had, one of the very first since the pandemic hit. And we went to see a folk singer who we loved for many years. And as I said in the first line, we were like monks emerging from vows of silence. But went, enjoyed the experience, reflected on the fact that had seen the singer at many different stages in our lives. And after I got home, I was moved to write it. I've been writing for a number of years. I've written now 27 plays and about a dozen short stories, but wrote it to capture not only that moment as we slowly started to emerge from the pandemic, which was an earth-shaking event. I mean, we should not minimize the gravity of what happened to all of us. But in any event, I wrote the story and was again so grateful that you published it.
Absolutely. And it was published elsewhere as well. We weren't the only people, right?
That is correct. That is correct. It was also published in a lovely online magazine called You Might Need to Hear This, based in Los Angeles.
Fantastic.
And it, there's been a lot of COVID writing, of course, but everyone has a different take on how the experience affected them. It certainly, I wrote a play also based on it, and not based on it, but influenced by it. That was very heavily influenced by my own experience with the disease. I caught it early on. So that was a much different piece than Fermata, which was a lighter look at memory loss and retrieval.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned you've worked in different medias extensively. How did you get your start? Did you start off with prose? Did you start off with scripts? How did it begin?
Well, I wrote my first play when I was 9, and then there was a bit of a gap. I was a journalist. I was in radio, and then spent many years working for the Associated Press and editing millions of words. I did a lot of writing. None of it really creative writing. Then I got into television behind the scenes, and there was a void. I wasn't really writing anymore. And I always loved theater. From the first time my mom took me to plays when I was a little boy. And I think Peter and the Wolf was the first one back in Providence. But anyway, I started writing, and there's a wonderful resource here in Chicago called Chicago Dramatists. And I took a couple of courses there. and have just been writing and writing, and I've had a number of productions, mostly small theaters in New York, uh, uh, and been a proud member of the Dramatists Guild for quite a while. And in like many writers and actors and other performers, of course, you get rejection, but I wasn't getting enough rejection, so I started turning to short stories. No, but actually, I was around 2014 or 15. I always loved short stories, loved the medium. Chekhov, Stuart Dybek, Raymond Carver, Lucia Berlin was someone I came to later, and she had a renaissance posthumously. And after my own dad died, and she wrote again a lot about loss and things, I started writing short stories too, and one of them I was honored to have you publish.
That's wonderful. Do you find that you approach these different mediums differently? I'm sure reporting is a completely different beast than creative work, but on a technical level, do you find yourself doing different things depending on the medium?
That's a fascinating question, and your own journalism background comes through in that. Um, I've always thought of writing as like exercise, and any exercise basically I think helps you in any other exercise, even if it's not the same skill set. And I can't tell you how many times over the years that training I got with the Associated Press for those 10 years, a lot of deadline content really taught us, all of us who worked in that medium, how to organize our thoughts, how to express them clearly. In particular, when I started, often we had to dictate stories, so you had to compose in your mind. And so I found, I just think the more you write, the better you get at it. Whenever I worked for many years in university communications after leaving journalism, what I would tell students, the more you write, the better you get at it. And interestingly, when I'm writing creatively, I always know either the title or the ending. That's the idea. That's what the story, the play is about. A ton of work, of course, goes into fleshing it out. Many drafts and rewrites and seeing actors, hearing actors, and I mean, I'm somebody who would change it right up until the second act. But uh, I know one of those two things.
That's great. How much do you rely on collaboration and community, specifically when writing plays, to build up the idea? Do you write it all alone and you're like, this is how I want it to be, and then hear ideas? Or do you get ideas throughout the whole process or suggestions? I mean,
That's an excellent question. A few things come to mind. First of all, it's really important, I think, to write down ideas or record them on your phone as they come to you. Because I can't tell you how many times when I've started, let's say, a full length, particularly, I've got a bag or a suitcase full of notes, and some of those things that I may have written 10 years ago been repeated on stage. I would not have remembered them. Saul Bellow, the great novelist, once said, "You never have to rewrite something you wake up in the middle of the night to write." So I know it's hard, but darn, if you wake up and you've had a dream or a nightmare or something, one of the plays I got the most good feedback on, was based on a nightmare. And it was performed a number of times in New York in small theaters. The writing process itself for me is extremely solitary. But I benefit so much from hearing good actors read, and clarifying things that need to be clarified, mostly cutting. Like many writers, I think I do tend to overwrite. And so really, do you need those? Can you turn those 10 words to 5? Can you do 5 with a gesture? And so really, not being an actor myself, I just benefit so much from actors, and sometimes when I've seen what a director has done with a play, and just that's not only informed that play, but other works and my approach. I didn't go to theater school, so it's sort of been a process of learning on the job. And, sometimes feedback I've gotten from a director or someone has made it into the new draft. I think I consider myself a fast writer for the first draft. I usually get things done quickly, but I will rewrite extensively. The best writing advice I ever got: don't get it right, RIGHT, get it written. And then, of course, as Faulkner said, it's writing is about killing your little darlings. The rewriting and the rewriting and the rewriting. And yeah, I love that phrase, but it slows it down. The version of Fermata that you published, I believe, was, and again, just to use this as an example, the first polished draft was 2,200 words. What I gave you was 15. Just cutting the fat. I don't think any of it was bad, but it just wasn't necessary to tell the story that I wanted to tell.
Absolutely. And I know from my own experience with script writing that concision is king, especially when you're doing um, works just to be sent out in a hope someone else will pick it up, because they're not going to get your style. They don't care if you have flowery phrases. They just want to know the story. So hearing you say that makes me think of all of the benefits of learning how to write for a visual medium. No one's going to sit there and focus on the way a sentence is written, in the audience at least. They're just going to watch the performance. So I'm wondering if you noticed anything in particular that's different, more challenging, easier in writing for a visual medium rather than for prose on the page.
Another excellent question. My news director, when I was in television, I was behind the scenes, but he said something early on that stuck with me. He said, when people turn on their television, what are they going to see? And, at the end of the day, that's what it's about, is the visual element and how much actors can do with a gesture, with a phrase, instead of a full sentence, facial expression. So definitely, whereas, what I just read to you from Fermata might have been just a couple of lines of dialogue. But again, painting a picture of what that particular day looked like, you get more in depth on the page. But again, in my career, fortunately, one thing I've had the benefit of is working in so many different media. It's I think I can approach things differently depending on the audience and the medium. I mean, and for example, when I was talking about working for the news agency, that made the transition to social media extremely easy for me, because, and not that I'm a guru, but I can write something that's very concise. Even with Twitter, it was 140 characters, now it's 280, but write something concisely, but at the same time segue into something that's over 100 pages in the case of a play. So you just have to be, you have to, was it Gertrude Stein who said to Hemingway, you have to concentrate, and you really have to enjoy the process of creation, the process of writing, and the solitude. And the way I always look at it is, I enjoy it. It's rewarding for me, and then if I get produced or published, it's a gift. It's the icing on the cake.
I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it, especially in an industry that deals with so much rejection. Finding a way to stay positive and still love it, because we all do it because we love it, and finding a way to keep that up is the best.
I think also it's been very helpful to me over the years to make sure you associate with and listen to people at all different stages. And of course, you can have someone who's older, who's relatively new. You can have someone who's young like you, but has got a lot of experience. But just, I've learned so much about social media or theatrical presentation for a younger audience from younger actors and directors. And indeed, one thing that's pleased me is that over the years, a lot of my plays have been selected for production or readings or stage readings, whatever, by people who are a much younger demographic.
Okay.
So I feel like I'm reaching people who are, outside my immediate circle.
Mhm.
And likewise, when you're talking to someone who's older, they have a vast amount of wisdom. And particularly if they've been doing this for a long time, you've got a lot to learn from them. So it's really important, I think, organizations like Chicago Dramatists or a thousand others, the Guild, I mean, it's obviously fantastic. But just, reading, I do think it's important. I don't know if you agree, but I certainly have always thought I have to think theatrically or think in terms of the medium, short stories,
Mhm.
because then what I see, what I absorb, what I learn, I start to translate into that. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
It's an inspiration for something. The other day, I was taking part in an online Tiger's Heart Theater in the Bronx, hosted an online gathering for playwrights and actors. This is something I never do, never do. But I mean, I do those all the time. But one thing I never do is I write to a prompt or write for a theme. If somebody says, but the theme they put out there was uh, on a snowy highway, and I'm from New England, Chicago, but on a snowy highway, a stranded person makes a deal with the devil, and you have to write this play in 6 lines. And I thought that's intriguing, so I did it. Yes, and it's stimulating. It's fun.
Mhm. Absolutely. I'm actually in a similar boat with you. I don't usually do prompts when it comes to that kind of thing. But I had last year, the year before, one of my friends sent me a link to a writing contest, and I don't usually do contests just because I just don't. But she was like, I think you should submit to this. And I looked at it, I looked at the prompt, and it was a post-apocalyptic world, and it had to involve a silver locket, I believe.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. I'm mostly a genre writer, so I'm like, I've never really written post-apocalyptic before. That would be cool. Um, and I noticed the deadline was like 2 days away. I'm like, oh, that's that's close. Um, but I did it. I spent 24 hours and I wrote the draft, and it wasn't the best it could be. I ended up not submitting to the contest just because like didn't want to. But I did have a writing group look over the draft, rewrote it a little bit, submitted it elsewhere, and it's one of my fastest exceptions on a short story, and it was fantastic. And I was absolutely
Congratulations.
thanks. Yeah, I was absolutely thrilled about it and really surprised. I just got really intrigued with color play. It was this idea that it was kind of like a great flood idea, kind of a play on that, and about
Oh, I
this
can't
girl.
wait to read it.
Yeah, I for some reason I believe the press that published it might have shut down. I know their website. Um, the last time I tried to go on it, there was an error page. Um, but the book is on Amazon because they print their publishes the issues. Um, and it was online, so I might be able to find it somewhere. But
We'll follow up with you after this. I'm going to buy it and read it because I'm
oh,
now very intrigued.
oh, well, thank you.
That's great though, and even I mean, even if you hadn't been published, just the fact that you did it and did took the challenge.
Mm,
I was talking to a playwright friend of mine in Perth. I don't know her personally, but we correspond through one of these
mm,
groups, and she said, finishing a play or a short story is a success. It's
mm.
true. I mean, take it from concept to execution to the point where you can submit it. And then in this case, obviously it was very good and somebody published it.
Thank you. Um, it is fantastic advice, though. That was advice I got a lot when I was first starting out in film. I lucked into a wonderful internship on a feature film my very first year of undergrad. I just had kind of
Wow.
happened into it. It was a tip from one of my professors. I messaged the Facebook page of the film, and they were like, "Yeah, we could use another intern." I'm like, okay. Um, so I met them at an abandoned news building in Annapolis because that's where they were shooting, and it worked out wonderfully. Um, but the advice from them is every single person in film writes scripts. But the hardest part about getting into the making movies is making movies. Like you can write as many scripts as you want, but if you can't prove that they're feasible for production, then it's much harder to sell. So that's always been my motto when it comes to film, especially is I can write a script as long as I can make it, I'll make it. Mhm.
Annapolis is beautiful,
It is. It is.
historic.
Mhm.
I love the water, but yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I forget what I read the ratio of scripts written to movies produced, and it was almost like being hit by a comet.
It's absolutely wild. But yeah, anyway, sorry, sidetracked. Um,
No, I love talking about writing and the creative process.
yes, same, same. To return to Fermata, though, I am curious if there are any themes in the story that you return to in your other works, or if there are any themes in general that you find bridge your other works.
Well, my work in short stories have tended to be, well, like plays too. They're kind of all over. I've written some historical allegories. I've written some that are surreal. The one I mentioned earlier, the one about the came out of a nightmare.
Mhm.
That was quite surreal. It included three chimpanzees who are represented symbolically on stage, as you might imagine. But but I think a lot of them look at people on the margins, people who are, for want of a better word, boxed in. Uh, some of my work is very political. And yeah, it was an encounter I had with a Holocaust survivor who lived near us, and uh, it was included in a public reading in England at a theater company on the topic of sanctuary couple years back. Recently, was read in the as part of the Chicago Public Library's Chicago Stories, and also been published. But basically, it was uh, based on an encounter there, but using it as an allegory for America in the time of Trump. The play I referenced earlier about inspired in part by COVID, although COVID's never mentioned, it's called Entrenched, and basically all three characters are dead, but they were talking about reflecting on their lives and diseases that can't be eradicated or cured in both the sense of ancient enemies like viruses, but also hatred and other things that we see tearing through the our country. I mean, I just saw today that a major LGBTQ group issued a travel advisory for Florida.
Mhm.
So, which an American state has to have a travel advisory. Um, it's so um, I've written mostly one act plays, but five full lengths. Um, themes of themes of war, what leads us into war, figure in a number of them. Myth, prejudice. So it's kind of a mixed, but of them, I would say all but a handful are either tragedy or dark comedy, drama. I've only written a few comedies. One was a satire of the religious right, which actually was called Defrocked, but it got some very good feedback when it's been produced to produced in New York and God, where else? Michigan, I believe. I have to remember, but anyway, New Jersey. I'm sorry.
That's wonderful. Have I've found that a lot of the writers I've been speaking to recently really are doubling down on the political nature of their work. And I personally think that's a wonderful thing. I think that literature and art, performance, all of it has to drive the conversation just as much as reacting to it. Um, do you find that having that political context makes it harder or easier to find an audience for your works?
Well, let's say finding an audience has been the biggest challenge. I've certainly persistent and productive. I don't consider myself particularly successful, but I keep doing it because I love it. And the pandemic hit a lot of artists hard, in all fields, as you know. And we're still kind of coming out of that. The play I mentioned about disease entrenched, it was included on a podcast in New York, but it's not yet been produced on the stage. I do think uh, there's been a lot of challenges. I think theater companies have closed. Theater companies have had to scale back. Um, it takes a lot of resources to put on a production, and so I just take comfort in the fact that when my work has been produced, generally speaking, people have responded well to it, and I do expect, as somebody told me very early on, you'll be sending 10 plays out, you get 10 back, and send out 10 more. So, persistence, perseverance, these are our friends. But I do think it's important to write things that have integrity for you. If I can look at things I did a long time ago and still feel like, okay, I may have changed something here or there, but I've been true to myself. I was just
Oh,
going to say one other thing on that subject. I just finished a masterful book about the battle to publish Ulysses,
mhm.
the
Mm,
most dangerous book. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the author. He's a professor,
mhm,
but the censorship, the arguments, it's being played out all over the country right now.
mhm.
Libraries trying to defund libraries, attacking LGBTQ people. It's just everything old is new again. So we have to keep fighting.
Absolutely. I recently, and by recently, I mean not even an hour ago, on Twitter saw a post by an author who was offered a promotion from the Scholastic Fair if she censored out a paragraph in her writer's statement about racism in America. And it's, I mean, it's blown up on social media, but I think it's really working to get writers who do not deal with that kind of censorship to really listen to more marginalized creators when they say there are issues at the root of some systems that back publications.
Absolutely. And after we get through, I know you and I follow each other on Twitter, so I'm going to
Yeah.
look for that. I haven't seen that yet.
Hmm.
A
Yeah,
lot of terrible
definitely.
stuff out there today. I haven't seen that one yet, but is young. But every day there's a new thing, and it's important, I think, for like-minded people to not be in an echo chamber, but to support each other and to again be true to what drew us to the art in the first place.
Yeah.
And again, it's you always have to read, learn, listen, be open-minded. Obviously, I come from a certain age, I'm a white male, certain background, from a small town in New England.
Mhm.
It's only by associating with people who are younger, older, different than I am, that I've been able to learn and broaden my horizons and be able to not try to capture the experience. I can't be the lived experience of
Yeah.
certain people perhaps whose lives are so much different than mine, but I can try to capture them and respect them and reflect them, if that makes sense. But at least try to represent their struggles in the context of the works.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. Um, this is slightly off topic, just circling back to what you
Sure.
said about the challenges of putting on productions in a pandemic world. Would you ever consider writing video plays or writing plays for Zoom production or something like that?
Actually, somebody suggested that recently, and it's something I really should give some thought to. I had a 1 minute play published in an international anthology recently, and I was saying to my friend, who's not in theater, lady I work with, I said, this will never get published. She said, why don't you do it as a TikTok? And all I would really need would be two actors lying in the grass. So yeah, that's probably something I should definitely do. Again, talking earlier, listening to younger people or people who've been in different fields, someone like yourself who's been in film, and learning, getting ideas. So thank you. I will definitely consider it.
Of course, happy to help. It just came to mind because I was having a conversation with someone else earlier who mentioned uh, many, many great works being done over live virtual theater, not so much as in like recording a play, but with the screen being the stage, the little box being the stage. And I imagine it poses many, many challenges, but I think that's part of the fun too.
I've seen a lot over the last few years, either actual productions, again, as you say, there's some limitations.
Yeah.
The play I was talking about that was on the podcast, it had some visual effects that you really couldn't capture on a podcast, but they did a heck of a job, the three actors, and they to the extent that you could capture it without visuals, they did.
Yeah.
So my hat was off to them. But to the point you just made, I've seen a lot of those, both readings or actual productions, and it comes alive. Yeah, it's not the same thing as being in maybe a big theater or a small black box, whatever. But it's theater. It's the lived experience. It's actors sharing, breathing life into the words of writers, and it's magic. It's wonderful. It's very special. It's just been a privilege to be part of it, especially someone like myself who wasn't trained in it per se, but came to it later. And again, short stories. You asked it earlier. You don't have to. You're creating more of a picture. You're creating the visuals in the reader's mind. That part is more challenging. But you're not thinking of how is this going to look on the stage, what's it going to sound like coming out of an actor's mouth. So certainly for me, I have to. Again, it's just a matter of concentration. Okay, this is what I'm doing. It's not a play, it's a short story.
Absolutely, absolutely. So currently, this is the dreaded what's next question, but can you tell us a little bit about anything you have coming up or just what you're working on right now?
Sure. Actually, this may resonate with you or anyone else who may be listening to this who's had experience. I've been noodling around in my mind for years, a short play or a longer one, depending. Um, I'm from Providence, Rhode Island, and Edgar Allan Poe had some history there. And in fact, he courted a woman in a cemetery where Lovecraft is buried, and also my mother is buried not too far from there, historic cemetery. And a theater out in California about a year ago posted something that said they wanted to do a festival of short plays about Poe or Lovecraft. And it just galvanized. And it was about a relationship Poe had with somebody. And they only wanted 15 minutes per play. So I gave, it was perfect for my what I knew and what I had and what I wanted to say, but they never heard back. No, so it's just one of those things. And anyone in theater can relate to this. I've had magazines that have accepted short stories and then they folded. I've had a theater company accept a play, and then they folded. This was during the Great Recession, in the aftermath. One of the plays I've had a lot of good feedback with was written in the aftermath of the Great Recession, 2008, 9, 10. Still trying to get them staged. I had public readings and really resonated with younger audiences because they were probably struggling more than people who are more established. But so anyway, I've been trying to shop the Poe play elsewhere. And also I've been for years working on a full length. And I keep getting sidetracked by other plays or projects. And then also working on a bunch of other short stories. At any given time, I probably have 6 different projects that I'm working on. And my phone, I record many, many, many ideas. So working on several things simultaneously. But I'd say right now the main thing is trying to get the Poe play out there and trying to finish this full length. It's been with me for many years. It's 114 pages and first draft, but I've really got to get this baby in shape.
Yeah, and how do you juggle all of those projects? Do you kind of just pick whichever one strikes your interest at any moment, or?
Sometimes they're driven by deadline. I mean, the Poe play is an example. I saw it on a website, that has theater opportunities. I had a short deadline, so that became front and center. The full length I was talking about, it's a personally challenging play for me, so I have to sort of be in the mood to be able to address it. But often other things, like I say, I'm very fast with my first draft, so I can write things very quickly. But then it's the writing and the rewriting, and I will read. I don't act, but I will read my own dialogue out loud for my stories to see how how it sounds. One of the I don't know if you've experienced this on the flip side, but when I was first writing plays, one of the things I had to learn was, convincingly writing characters for women. Because really, just getting different people's voices, and it's like anything else. You just practice, practice, practice. So hearing actors again is just so important. Actresses, I mean, just so. And of course, in Chicago, so much theatrical talent, so many great people you can work with. I worked at 2 universities here that had excellent theater programs. Would have the students do readings, and it was wonderful. And I know a lot of people in New York who are willing to kindly give of their time. Again, it just helps so much to hear talented actors read your stuff. And I always, even a short play, I'll think of 6 things when I hear, oh, okay, we gotta fix that.
That's fantastic advice too, especially with dialogue. Hearing it out loud helps so much. I remember one of my first semesters in a cinema program for the dialogue portion. It was for an audio class, I believe, and just to go out in the world and not creepily transcribe what people said to each other, and just actually looking at the way people speak to each other. It's not how we think it happens, and it's fascinating.
That's the thing, and how different types of people speak in different jobs and from different backgrounds. Making it real, giving it that verisimilitude. Really your authentic voice. And in historical plays are even more challenging, of course, because you're trying to give it some sense of the period. what helps there, I think, if you're doing something, like one play I wrote, one of my first plays was an allegory for what I saw as the coming authoritarian takeover of American government, which sadly has turned out to, I think, closer than I would have liked. But it was set in the 1840s, but reading the actual letters and transcriptions to the extent that they had them, speeches that people gave, you at least get the voice, I think, more than you might otherwise have. You don't want to sound like a 21st century individual putting words in the mouth of, an 1840s revolutionary.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. I also love that advice. I one time wrote an epistolary piece from the Reformation period was when it was
Wow.
set, and I had the privilege of working at a historical society down in Maryland at the time that I was writing this piece, and I had access to their archives and to journals, and I was able to hold and look at a journal from someone at the exact same time period I was writing for. And I remember the archivist who lent it to me. She's like, "Are you sure it's mostly farming details?" I'm like, "Yeah, no, that's totally fine." I'm like, "I just want to know how he writes." Because I didn't want to overdo it, but I also didn't want it to sound clunky. I'm like, if he doesn't use contractions, I don't want to use contractions just because they sound better, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, sir. It has to. And by the way, we would be remiss if we didn't note that today is we're recording this is the birthday of Samuel Beckett
Mhm.
in 1906. But one of the truly spiritual experiences of my life was going in the treasures room at the British Library. And to your point, seeing actual writing, there's that one little piece of writing that they believe is in Shakespeare's hand
Mhm.
on a Thomas Kidd play, and the only copy of Beowulf. But I mean, just to actually see this material in front of you,
Mhm. It's fantastic.
inspiring.
Absolutely, absolutely. So for my final question to
Yes,
you,
ma'am.
if you could give any one piece of advice to writers out there in any medium, what would that be?
I'm borrowing it from the guy I learned from years ago. Don't get it right, get it written. Ultimately, no one cares about your ideas. No one cares about your first draft. You need to put words on paper, on your computer. I always print it out, look at it. That helps me for some reason. And then write and write and rewrite. But you have to get it done. And I know that sounds really simple, but it's really hard. And um, most of the stuff I've had, even short plays that produced, were probably 10th drafts. And I would say at least three of them required as much research as a master's thesis. So, I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into anything. And I just have so much respect for novelists and, people who have things on Broadway and all of that. But, even those of us who are just, out there fighting the good fight, it's, you really got to work at it. So don't get it right, get it written, and then take a step back, take a critical eye, be open to advice. I know you asked for one thing. I'm giving one. Be open to criticism, but at the same time, you got to understand sometimes there is. One time I had a reading, and then it was a big cast, so all the actors gave some very good, well-meaning advice. But I realized that if I listened to everybody's advice, I would have an entirely different play or no play at all. So I had to think, okay, what here works for what I want to say? And for the rest of it, I appreciated their input. It was all good, but just not for this particular project. So, and like anything, any other field, associate with people who are going to uplift you. people who you respect, magazines like yours. Read, read, read. Right, right, right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for that advice and for being here. It's been wonderful, wonderful speaking to you.
It is just great to see you in person, and thank you again for publishing it. And I look forward to reading your work and much more of you in the future. And thanks again to everyone at Page and Screen.